Thank you, Chloe. Is that better? Now we go. I did the calculation actually for 15 children. That's where you get 8,000 tries to have everybody have the same side of the coin. And then it's 100% probability, but it's still a probability it might not happen, interestingly enough. And we'll come back to this later, but I think the children got this and the parents might need to think about it. Every time you have an event that could be one way or another, in order to find out the final probability of all the events happening, you have to multiply the probabilities together. Does that make sense? You're not all with me on this, you're thinking about it. So to get heads twice would be a half times a half, or what? A quarter. And I don't think I put it on here, but, and by the way, we would call that 25%. So what we're going to do for a minute here, I want you all to be involved. What was in those bags are some children's snap blocks. And we're going to let the snap block represent an amino acid. Most of you are aware of the fact that proteins are made up of a chain of amino acids. Let me see how many knew that already. Can I see your hands? Some of you are afraid to put your hand up. You know it now. Proteins are, with no exceptions, made up of a chain of amino acids. And chemically, the amino acids hook together. What I'm going to have you do is pretend like you're children and push them together. So we're going to start at the end. Everybody in the row, I want you to get an amino acid and hook it up. Now you could just make them all straight. Don't do that. Be original. Go sideways or something. And each of you add one and quickly do it and bring it clear to the end here. So at the end of each aisle, I'm going to have a little protein that you have put together. Did you guys not get any? There's no bag? That bag is coming. Okay. So you understand? In a few minutes, I want to collect at the inside of each row your creation. And I really want the children to be involved. And you may have to help them push them together. But, okay. And just like Bob is doing here, have it ready for me to pick up. And what I'm going to do is take the protein that each row make and make more, bigger. Is yours done? We'll just connect it here somewhere. Like this, if I can keep them from falling apart. Who's ready? Oh, look at this one. Here, you add one to it. Okay. In fact, why don't you help me put those together while I collect some more? This is nice. Look at these nice designs here. Whoops. Broke. Well, it's okay, we'll hook it up anyway. There we go. And hook this part in there somehow. And this is very good. I've never done this before, folks. I dream about these things while I'm laying in bed at night. That's why I can't sleep, Bob said. Help me put this together without it falling apart. Somewhere in there like that, wherever you. Okay. It's hard, I know. Whoops. It's really falling apart. Here we go. Thank you. Was that yours, dear? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Elaine. Nice to see you. By the way, we have some guests here today. There are several, but Pastor Wayne Cablano and his dear wife.
When man tries to create, it doesn't work.
Not so well. This is a good observation. Okay, let's just pretend like we did hook these together before any more falls apart. Now listen, parents, as well as children. Since there are 20 different kinds of amino acids that our bodies use, if you're going to build a protein by chance, the probability of getting it right would be 1/20th, the first choice. Are you all with me on that? And the next choice, if the probability of getting the second one correct would be now 1/20th times 1/20th. Is that correct? 1/400th. This is a pretty tiny protein, actually. Thank you, sweetheart. Just lay it in. Oh, good, just like that. That's going to work. The average protein in your cell, which the cell has to have to live, has 200 to 300 amino acids. And if even one amino acid is the wrong one, I'll give you an example. There are 474 amino acids in the red blood cell in order to make what the red blood cell needs. And if only one amino acid is the wrong one, and this is common because of genetics, people have sickle cell anemia. For how many mistakes? One. And the idea that you could make even one protein by accident right is ridiculously small. Are you all with me on this? It takes about 100,000 different proteins in the cell for it to live and function. 100,000 different ones. There might be 1 million copies of one, 500,000 copies of another, 300,000 copies, but 100,000 different ones, multiple copies of each needed to make the cell function. So it's quite remarkable. And that people could even, that some of the smartest people in the world will buy the idea that this whole thing happened by chance. Are y'all with me on that? I think I mentioned here, or was it in another place recently? It was here in a Sabbath school class that, and I'll show you some interesting results of this, that the scientific community, many of these people have to stay in the closet, are more and more realizing that this thing had to be created. When I say this thing, life, had to be made by some intelligent source. Very, very interesting. 50 years ago, the president of Andrews University, and for the children here who may not know much about this, this is the place where virtually all our pastors are trained to be Bible teachers and preachers, and other people that are going to need to know more about the Bible are trained there. He was the president, and he decided that he was going to stop believing that there was a God. He left his position. He left, if you will, the church. He left believing in God. Because of this picture that you see on the left side of the screen. This is a simplified version of what we call the geologic column, all the different layers of rock from millions and millions of years ago up till our day. The average scientific opinion is that these layers of rock formed underwater as sediment slowly drifts down and makes a layer, and eventually that layer becomes rock. And they believed that all of these layers were fashioned over millions of years. And when the president learned, follow my arrow, that humans are only found in the upper layers, and that there was living creatures in the form we see it today as fossils. I don't know if the children understand, but anytime you find in a rock somewhere even a print of a leaf, or even where a stick was, we call any record of life like that a fossil. And in the fossil record are these living creatures or plants. And when he saw that the scientific community believed that man was the last thing that appeared, and that the Bible teaches that the first life on earth was man. Are y'all following me? This is a little hard for the youngest children. What did he assume? The Bible is wrong because the scientific community shows that there was life long before man. Are y'all with me on the argument? And this educated PhD, the president of Andrews University, because of this, turned away. Now, for those of you children that are old enough, 10 years or so old and older, the devil has 1,000 ideas to get you to leave the church as you grow up. He has 1,000 things. He can get people to leave the church over something like this because you get so involved in listening and watching. I don't even want to start enumerating them. My appeal to not only children, really, as all of us, is that the devil is lurking around every corner to try to confuse us and get us to turn away from our belief in God and in a Creator. And I'm especially concerned about the children, obviously, as all of you are, that somehow in this church family we could work in a way to limit maybe to zero this departure. One of the young women that used to be in this church, I can picture her sitting at the piano playing and singing and playing her violin, has been living on the streets for years. It just breaks your heart. Now, it's interesting, most of you are reasonably familiar with the fact that Charles Darwin wrote this book. It has a long title, but the short title is On the Origin of the Species. He recognized that there was a problem even in the geologic column as the scientists understand it. I don't want to take much time on this, but you see where it says Precambrian? You see there's no creatures there? There are actually some microscopic, single-celled creatures that we see in the fossil record. But suddenly, there are complicated life forms. Now, they're not what we're used to seeing. I guess I had that picture covered up. Maybe I can show it to you after all. I don't see it there, so I won't. Anyway, he tells in his book that he realizes there's something wrong with his theory because suddenly life appears in very complex forms, even though they're funny little tribalites or whatever you want to call them. And he believed that the fossil record would eventually solve this problem. Any geologist today knows that the sampling is complete enough that we're never going to see how suddenly life appeared in very complex forms. Are you all with me? And so this book written by Stephen Meyer called Darwin's Doubt tells that story. And even though it was simple creatures in comparison to mankind, it was all of a sudden, it's called the Cambrian explosion. How many of you have ever heard the term Cambrian explosion? Like a dozen of you. All right. Now let me try to deal with an answer to this problem. This is a picture of a ridge in Yellowstone Park called Specimen Ridge, in which there are 27 layers, geologic layers on top of each other. I've taken groups of students up there. My wife and I have hiked up there. Further to your right and lower toward the creek, there are areas where, it says there on the left, 50 layers of petrified trees. And the standard scientific opinion about that has been for a long, long time that each of those layers took thousands of years to form in the way I described, sediment slowly making a layer underwater. And therefore, this shows how millions of years have gone by for this thing to form. A friend of mine, a professor friend, got permission to go and actually drill into the standing petrified trees and look at the rings. He spent some period of time, because there's all these layers, and found out that they all lived at the same time. And after this experience, y'all remember this? Old enough? There was a huge mud flow that caused Spirit Lake to raise something like 100 feet, and it got filled with trees that all got blown over by the blast. You can see the top of Mount St. Helens is gone there. And some creation scientists got to thinking about this and figured out that as the trees would get waterlogged and they would sink, some of them sunk down vertically. Some of them laid down. They actually did some sonar scanning, and this is an actual photograph. You see this picture, can you see this tree floating there? And there's the top of the water right there, and the tree is just floating near the top, something like these, only straight up and down. You all with me? Here's the sonar of the bottom showing that some of the trees have gone down there and settled on the bottom vertically. And the fascinating thing about this whole story is that the mud flow and by the way, the picture I showed you is the largest landslide ever recorded in the history of the earth. Now, there's evidence of landslides that we weren't around to watch, but this one is the largest recorded landslide ever in the history of the world, recorded. In other words, somebody saw it. It made a huge mud flow for miles and miles and miles. And then the magma melted the glacier and the snow, so there was a torrent of water that washed away a bunch of the mud. And what you see in the picture here is absolutely fascinating. You see all those layers? Y'all with me on this? Do I need to draw it? Those were all formed in a couple of hours. Y'all with me on this? And then the water, because of the melting snow and glacier, came through and washed a portion of the way so you could see the layers. Look at that. A thick and sometimes layers that are just a few millimeters are formed during this kind of process. And does that look a lot like Specimen Ridge? So likely Specimen Ridge was formed probably during the flood, perhaps after the flood, with volcanoes. And the trees in the water did what we saw at Mount Spirit Lake. So there is a reasonable explanation, friends, that the geologic column, which scientists think took millions and millions of years to form, was formed quickly during or after the flood. And you have a hard time finding people in the scientific community who are widely known admitting that. But I told you in the Sabbath school class, was it a week or two ago, that today Even though many are, as I say, in the closet, I think you all know what I mean by that. 50% of the scientists in this country now believe that there was a designer. Even though they don't believe in God. They recognize this thing could not have happened. And I'm going to show you a really interesting example of that in a minute. Several weeks ago, my wife and I went with a couple friend of ours, pastor, retired pastor, went up and I took this picture at Grand Canyon. You see the layers. Layer after layer after layer after layer. The standard explanation has been that these layers were deposited over thousands and thousands and millions of years. The problem is, if a layer is deposited and it takes a few thousand years or more for the next one to come, there should be lots of changes in the surface from erosion. And you can go to any of these layers and you can go as far as you want. You can't find any erosion. What does that tell you? These layers were all put down one right after the other. Probably quite like St. Helens. And there was a huge lake. It's quite apparent now. And by the way, in case you don't know much about the Ice Age, the ice came as far south as Arizona. And there was a dam there, and people have named this lake that was behind this dam Olympia. And eventually, because things were warming up, the dam broke. And Grand Canyon was probably formed in a couple of days. Are y'all with me on this? Not a little tiny river that slowly ate away this thing. A geologist by the name of Brackett, don't hold me to this date, I looked it up a while back. I think it was in 1929 or 34, something along in there, explained to a group of geologists that the whole eastern portion of Washington state, this desert out there, was formed in hours by the same kind of a thing. He was laughed off the stage. Today, every geologist recognizes that what Brett said was correct. So that these long ages that have been purported to be do not hold water, if you will. There's another close-up of the same thing. No erosion, folks, between these layers. Very interesting. Now I want to turn to the stars. I won't take time like we did a couple of months ago. I'll just pick up a couple of things. Many of you were here, many of you were not. But this is Orion. His right shoulder is the star Betelgeuse, which comes from an Arabic name. And Betelgeuse is a big star in comparison to our sun. And I'll make Betelgeuse by itself, and I'll put our sun in the middle. That is the right ratio of size. I'm going to put our Earth in there. It's way too big, but I have to make it big enough for you to see. It's 93 million miles. I didn't mean to do that. It's 93 million miles away from the sun. If Betelgeuse was where our sun is, where would we be orbiting? For a few microseconds, we would be orbiting inside the sun. So our sun is a rather small star, frankly, in comparison to many. But the point is, the universe is out there, and how did it come to be? Prior to 65, there was wide belief among astronomers that the universe had always existed. In other words, it had no beginning. This is a very interesting concept. As you know, that has changed, and I'm going to speak to that very briefly. I don't know if anybody has ever challenged you with this thought. You claim, and I claim, I don't like that word claim, I believe, as you do, that God has existed forever. And if somebody says, well, who made God? You can help them a little bit by saying, well, you know, the scientists at one time believed that the universe had existed forever. And as long as it has existed forever, you can't talk about its beginning. Are you all with me on that? So if they have trouble believing that God existed forever, just remind them that the scientists at one time believed that the universe existed forever. So you shouldn't have a problem with worrying about how it started if it has existed forever. However, a couple of scientists by the name of Wilson and I can't read it now. I can say it. Yeah, they built an antenna. This is quite large, to try to measure something that scientists believed was there, but nobody had ever seen it before. And it was hooked to an amplifier in this shed, and they had a screen in there and so forth. But something was wrong with their electronics. And I'm sorry. They built this to look for radio signals. If I had time this morning, we'd do some physics on radio signals, but I won't do that to you. But most of you know that radio signals are generated in the universe and are traveling around, right? You can measure them. And they wanted to do a better job of looking for those radio signals. And as they were building this, there was this hiss in the electronic amplifier, and they kept fooling with it. And finally it dawned on them, Penzias is his name, it dawned on them that there was a real signal there. It wasn't just noise in the amplifier. Y'all with me? And they discovered what has come to be called the cosmic microwave background. On the bottom of the screen it says, there was a real signal of microwaves coming to the Earth from every place in the sky where you looked, not at galaxies, just everywhere. And what did they receive for this remarkable discovery? The Nobel Prize. Now, the scientific community had actually thought about some kind of a Big Bang. In case you've all heard the term, but just to make sure you understand, for them that meant that there was nothing, and somehow there was an explosion that made everything, and it's kind of flying away. And when Edwin Hubble, after whom the space telescope was named, was using the Mount Wilson Observatory there in the Los Angeles area, 100-inch mirror, he began to see all these galaxies that up until that time, people thought they were just some nebula out there, some light, but they were galaxies. And he was able to show that all of these galaxies were moving away from us. I mentioned that in the Sabbath school class about 2 months ago, whenever it was. And I asked the audience, I asked the congregation, if all of the galaxies that we see out there are moving away from us, what does that tell you about us? We're at the center. And by the way, I won't take the time right now. You know that Ellen White says that Jesus is going to come through Orion when he returns. But let me show you the result of this. This is their screen, no matter where they looked. And the idea is there that the brighter the color is, even the blue is bright, but the brighter the color, the stronger the microwave signal. So no matter where you look with this instrument, and this has since been tested by satellites and verified, you see this radio signal coming at you that we call microwaves. Now microwaves are like this long or this long or this long, and if they get this long in the infrared, you can feel it. You ever drive by a bonfire with your window rolled up? And what do you notice as you drive by the bonfire? You feel the heat. It's infrared radiation, radio signals if you want, that can pass through glass. And you feel that. But here's what the scientists believe. Because of the cosmic microwave background, listen to this carefully, folks. I hope the young people, at least 9 and older, are getting this part. This is really important. Because of this microwave background, scientists believe, listen to this, that the universe had a beginning. How many of you knew that? Let me see your hands. One hand. Let me repeat it if you're puzzled. On the basis of these measurements, which is one of the reasons they got the Nobel Prize, scientists recognized, they believed that the universe had a beginning. Is that a big deal? Yes, because if there's a beginning, there had to be a beginner. Are y'all with me on this? You cannot find a credible scientist in the world that disagrees. They all believe, based on these measurements, that the universe had a beginning. Now let me explain why. But is that a big deal that they believe that? Amazing. Now the idea is that when that explosion occurred, that they believe that's how it happened. The Bible says he spake and it was done. But they believe there was an explosion, and that created a lot of heat. It created particles that became suns, they believe, and worlds and stuff. But it made a lot of heat. And that's what the cosmic microwave background is. That's the manifestation. And it's slowly cooling down. When it was real hot, you could see it. Nobody was around to see it, in their opinion. But as it cooled down, you can now only see it with like a radio receiver. Does that make any sense to you at all? When it cools down and loses energy, the wavelength gets longer and longer. And we can only see with our naked eye wavelengths that short or shorter. Y'all with me on this? So because these waves have gotten longer, we can't see it, but you can measure it with instruments. And the idea is that if the wavelength was once real short because it was so hot, and now it's this long, you can figure out how old it is. Are y'all with me on that? And so they believe that the universe is 13.7 billion years old, based on the temperature of the cosmic ray background. Most of you are still awake. I'm very pleased. I understand, folks. I'm excited about these things, and maybe you're not. But I think we ought to be. Do you think we ought to become informed on these issues? Amen. As Christians, as people who believe that there's a creator? I believe that. And that's why we're not having a regular sermon today. All right. There had to be a beginner. I'm going to pass this picture up because of time. It just shows our galaxy and a nearby galaxy and some other galaxies that you can look at with a telescope. This is really fascinating. Some scientists decided to look, and I mentioned this that Sabbath, but I'm going to take a minute on it, at a piece of sky that was the size of a pinhead, top of a pin, at arm's length. And they exposed the Hubble telescope for 11 days in a spot where there were just several stars, and that's all. And this is what they found after that 7 days. They found in that little area 10,000 galaxies. You're not too impressed. I wished a bunch of you would have said, every dot of light is not a star. It's another galaxy. And it's not just that spot. You move your pin over, and there's 10,000 galaxies behind that one. And that one. Are y'all with me? And if you can imagine this ball, I'm inside, where my shoulder is the center of the sphere or the ball, I should be able to figure out how many pin tops are on the inner surface. Are y'all with me on that? Now, I've done the calculations. I'm not going to take time. If you're interested, you can look at them. Here they are. There's the size of the pinhead and 10,000 galaxies. If we took time, I'd remind you how to get an area of a circle and the area of a sphere, and all of that's on here. But the final result is that down here at the bottom, there are 5,000, I'm sorry, believe it or not, there's 5,760,000 pin sizes in that sphere. Are y'all with me? And behind each one of them, how many galaxies is there? 10,000. So you multiply that number of little tiny pin heads. And how many galaxies then do you get? About 58 billion galaxies. Now, I want you to understand something that's just mind-boggling. And you can see I'm moving quickly. This equation that I think everybody from the 5th grade on up have heard of, this is Einstein's equation. He figured out that if you take some mass and you convert it to energy, you'll get this much energy. And C, I don't know why the people use C. It'd be easier for you if it was an S. The mass times the speed of light squared. Now the speed of light is a 3 with 8 zeros. And here's the calculations. I'd love to take the time, but the point is that and this afternoon after lunch, we're going to have a course on nuclear physics for dummies. I'm teasing you. In the sun, in the beginning, scientists believe, and God probably did that, it's hydrogen. And hydrogen is the simplest chemical there is in the universe. It has only one particle. Actually, I need to make it colored for my scheme. It has only one particle in the nucleus. We call it a proton. And one electron flying around it. Just for fun, that proton is so tiny that if you scaled it up to this size, the electron would be out there 6 miles. Which means that you and I are 99.999999% empty. Because all the atoms are like that. Aren't you made up of atoms? Aren't you and I made up of nothing but atoms, right? In terms of physical stuff. And all of those atoms are mostly empty space because the electrons are way out there. In any case, that hydrogen in the sun, this is what's happening. If you get them hot enough, 2 hydrogens will fuse and they won't fuse properly unless there's 2 neutrons with them. So that happens to be helium. 2 protons, and with these 2 neutrons is a helium nucleus. And if you weighed all 4 of these individually and then weighed them after they're hooked together, you want to know what happens? That thing weighs less than the 4 of them individually. And that loss of weight got converted to energy. That's what makes the sun hot. Are y'all with me on that? Scientists discovered helium in the sun. They didn't know what I just described to you, but that was part of the picture. Now, it turns out that's a hydrogen bomb. You take individual hydrogens, and you get to hook 2 together, and of course you've got to have the neutrons there. But in order to make a hydrogen bomb happen, you know what a hydrogen bomb is called in the scientific community? A thermonuclear device. What does that mean? What does thermo mean? Hot. You have to explode an atom bomb to get it hot enough for this to take place and make your hydrogen bomb. Are y'all with me on this? Where did it go? Here it is. So, and here, I've done the calculation just for fun. A little tiny, I used the tip of an eraser, the tip of a pencil eraser. A little handful about like that. If you could turn those erasers, and it doesn't matter what mass you have, if you can figure out a way to turn mass into energy, this equation, that would be all you need for the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. Anybody have any idea what the output of energy was from that bomb? Anybody? 20 kilotons. 20,000 tons of dynamite from just changing that much mass into what? Energy. Now, listen carefully. In order to make something, in order to make mass, you have to have the same amount of energy. Y'all with me? You didn't get that. If you can get the energy out of that thing, that means that if you didn't have that thing and you had the energy, you could make it. And that equation, because it's the speed of light squared, the speed of light times the speed of light is an awful big number. It's 9 with 16 zeros. So just to make a little bit of mass, just to make the end of this pew would probably take billions and billions and billions of joules is the measurement, or if you want use foot-pounds or something, just to make that much. How could there ever be an explosion? And the scientists, listen to this, this is crazy. They actually believed there was nothing. I'm serious. And that an explosion happened with enough energy to create not just a few ends, but the whole universe. Are y'all with me on this? It's ludicrous. I actually listened to a scientist the other day. I had not heard of this book. He actually published a book called Something from Nothing. Now, listen. We should never make fun of anybody no matter what they believe. But I want you to get a tiny grasp of what it means to make a bunch of matter, not even just one earth. I mean, you can actually teach children to make calculations. I could sit here and do it for you. How many foot-pounds of energy it would take to create the earth, because I know how much the earth weighs. We know that. That's just one little speck of dust. Not to mention suns that are so big we would be orbiting inside, right? It is just ludicrous, folks, beyond belief that somebody could believe that an explosion occurred out of nothing to give you that much energy. Are y'all with me in what I'm trying to describe? And it seems to me that this kind of thing should be known by our people, should be known by us, and it would keep us from faltering if somehow we got tempted to kind of turn away from what we had known. All right. That's the Hiroshima bomb. And you've seen the pictures of the devastation. So now let's talk about proteins for a minute that you all helped me with. That was really nice. I've never done that before. I've dreamt about asking people, isn't that great? Let me just remind you, even if you had the amino acids, and the question is, where would they have come from? But let's say you had them. And you're going to build a protein by chance because you understand that Darwin's theory, it's amazing how people go for this. And let me tell you why I think they do. This is a sidetrack. See, folks, if you and I believe that there is a creator God, and if we're moral people, isn't it obvious that we should recognize that we have a responsibility to that person? Sure. And people don't want that. So they will go to no end of crazy ideas to try to create these things. But is it clear to you that if I'm going to just by chance pick an amino acid one after the other out of this box, has billions of amino acids, and where did they come from, right? And there's only 20 different kinds, that it's 1/20th times 1/20th times 1/20th times 1/20th. Y'all with me on this, right? The probability of getting one correct is just ridiculously small. And let me show you a really interesting, I think it's pretty close here in my slides. Let's just say that, just for fun, 100 amino acids, that's the one chance out of that many that you would get it right with just 100. That you'd have to say trillion 32 times. A trillion, 32 times, that one chance out of that many to get it right, if there were 100. Listen, that's a tiny protein, 100 amino acids. Let me show you something. This protein, and by the way, some of you know this, proteins are able to do a job because of their shape. And this is kind of an aside, this is nutrition, but you and I do not use any proteins that we eat as they are. We take them apart, they become amino acids, the amino acids go to our cells, and our cells have factories that build the proteins we need. Period. There's no other way. And this is one of them. And you guys came pretty close to that. Listen to this. 1,800 amino acids. I wish you were more impressed. How many times would you have to multiply 1/20th times itself to get the probability of getting this right? 1,800 times. It's ridiculous, friends. Now, this particular protein, and some of you know this, even if I say it, it may not make that much sense. But the reason the cell can build the proteins it needs is because the DNA has the information to assemble the protein correctly. Are you with me on that? So the gene that codes for this protein, that's the way the scientists like to say it. A gene codes for this protein. You could say it's the pattern. The gene that codes for this protein was believed, I need a blackboard, was believed to be a gene that caused breast cancer. So they named it BR for breast, CA for cancer. It turns out, we were mistaken. That gene and the resulting protein, we now know that that gene is a tumor suppressor gene. So that protein is the tumor suppressor protein. And this is how it works. Anytime our bodies copy a cell, like you cut yourself, you probably have 10 million cells that copy to fix it. And there's no exception to this. When I get to heaven, I'm going to biology class, and this is going to be one of my questions. Would you agree with me that when a cell copies itself, it has to make a copy of the DNA in that cell for this one, right? Yes. There's always mistakes. We call them copy error. And a huge amount of cancer that occurs in us is the result of copy error. And this is so fascinating, friends. This protein, with its elegant shape, and even one amino acid wrong, this thing would not work. This protein is not a living creature. It's just a machine. And proteins can actually, they can change shapes and so forth and do things. This thing travels along the new DNA and fixes the mistakes. Did you get that? Here's the cell that copies itself for whatever reason. There's all kinds of reasons. The new DNA is full of mistakes. This one and a host of other tumor suppressor proteins fix the mistakes. Pardon me. He says with kindly mocking the idea that it could have happened by chance. It's beyond the pale, friends. Listen, if given enough time. I know that, Bob. I understand completely. But it's a good point. And how many of you have heard me talk about Jim Tour? Can I see your hands? A couple of you remember. You got to listen to this man. He's a Jewish man who became a Christian. And boy, he loves Jesus Christ. It's just beautiful. And he interviews now on his little podcast Nobel laureates who are believers in Jesus Christ. It is so cool. His first question is always the same. He will say to this man or woman who's a Nobel laureate, you know what I mean by that? You're an intelligent person. You're educated. How could you possibly believe in something as crazy as the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? And it's wonderful to hear their voices. Now listen carefully. The other day, Jim interviewed, I can almost say his name, John, it doesn't matter. He got a Nobel Prize for something I won't get into, interesting enough. And he wrote a book called Genetic Entropy. Now, entropy is a word that you and I don't use very often, correct? Does anybody know what it means? Don't tell me, just let me see if you know. A couple of scientists in here, several. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So as entropy increases, things are more chaos. And he has shown in his work that without tumor suppressor proteins, the entire world would be dead from cancer in 40 years. Genetic entropy. Get it? Our genes, all of us folks, have lots of mistakes in the genes in our cells. All of us do. Because I didn't mention this, the mistake fixers miss some. So there's always mistakes that reside. Are you with me on that? That's going to be my next question in biology class in heaven. Well, we've run out of time. We're supposed to quit at 10 after. And I would like you to stay after lunch if you would. I have some other things I want to show you that I think you'll find interesting, including a little physics course on, what shall I call it? Nuclear physics for dummies. I say that about my... Listen, folks, am I a dummy in comparison to anybody in heaven? Sure, what do I know? See. So, but I think you'd be fascinated to see some of these things again and how they reflect on creation. Let's pray. Father, we thank you, oh Lord, so many things, for your mercy, for your love, for your hand in our lives, for your plan for each of us. Even though the plan includes trials, you know just the ones we need. And I just pray, Lord, that we can become more and more settled, irrespective of information, supposed information that people throw at us, that we have not only a creator God, we have a loving Creator God who died for us. And oh Lord, we want to be there together with our children. I pray for those who have slipped away. You always are working to bring them back to yourself, and there are many times when we are part of that picture. Help us, Lord, to not miss those opportunities, I pray. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, this song is certainly apropos. It took a miracle. Number 111, and shall we all stand?